My name is Hank Delgado, and I'm 61 years old. For most of my life, I've been called a lot of things. Mechanic, grease monkey, wrench turner, never engineer, never scientist, never builder of futures. But I didn't mind, not really, because I wasn't trying to prove anything, at least not to most people, except my son, Darren. He's 34 now, an aerospace systems engineer, top of his class at Stanford, multiple awards, fast-tracked into leadership at a NASA partner firm by the time he was 30. He calls me Hank, not Dad. Has for years. Says it sounds more professional. When people asked what his father did, he'd say he fixes engines. He never said where. Never mentioned the quiet little shop hidden behind NASA's propulsion lab in Alabama. Never mentioned that I was the one people came to when the blueprints didn't match reality, when things didn't line up the way they were supposed to, when calculations failed, but instinct didn't. I've never had a college degree, never wrote a research paper, but I've been building and tuning machines since before he was born. My hands have touched launch stabilizers, inertial dampers, torque housings for systems people aren't even allowed to name in public. I've been listed on documents as External Tech Advisor Non-Disclosure Grade, which is a fancy way of saying you do the work but we won't put your name on it. And I was fine with that. I didn't need applause. But I never thought the person who'd dismiss me the hardest would be my own son. I still remember the words. We were sitting in my kitchen. He had come home for Thanksgiving 4 years ago. First visit in nearly 6 years. I asked him about his work, genuinely curious. He explained something about composite fuel channels and vibration thresholds. I listened, nodded. Then I said, sounds like they're still overbuilding for torque compensation. You'd get better balance if you added a floating ring to absorb the shake. He paused, looked at me like I had spoken a different language. Then with a half laugh he said, you fix cars, Dad. I build rockets. He didn't mean it as a joke. That was the last holiday he came home. After that, I stopped asking. I kept my head down. I kept working. One winter morning, about 2 years later, a project manager at NASA called me into the back room, quietly. He said they had a problem with a new stabilizer system. The engines were misfiring during vibration tests at Mach threshold. They had tried recalibrating. Didn't work. He slid a blueprint across the table. Think you could take a look just off the record? I did. It didn't take long. I saw the problem in 10 minutes. The torque wasn't being redistributed properly. The stabilizer core was too rigid. They needed give, not more strength, more adaptation. I sketched out a ring-based damper modified from an old off-road racing design I had once built in my garage. The guy blinked. You think this would work in zero gravity, I said. It worked on Earth with half the budget and triple the dust. Give it a shot. He did. 3 weeks later, they called me back. It worked. Not only did it stabilize the engines, but it cut projected failure rates by 38%. They integrated it quietly into the Artemis T7 build. No official memo, no plaque. Just a handshake in a hallway, and one line in an internal report, stabilization improvements sourced externally, non-attributed. I didn't care. Until the day I saw my name, my actual name on the guest list for the launch ceremony. It was printed small at the bottom, listed as Contractor Advisor, Torque Systems. I hadn't even asked to be included, but I went. I ironed my one good shirt, drove alone, sat in the second to last row of the auditorium. Darren was in the front, center stage, wearing a sleek black suit, confident, proud. I hadn't seen him in almost 3 years. He didn't know I was in the room. Didn't know I'd be in there the whole time. Until someone said my name, not Hank, Mr. Delgado. A voice from the stage, the director of engineering. And suddenly, everything changed. They had almost reached the end of the ceremony. It was held in one of NASA's quiet, low-profile facilities, the kind the public doesn't really see. No countdown clocks, no press coverage, just rows of seats, a polished podium, and a projection screen with digital renderings of the Artemis T7 shuttle rotating slowly on loop. The program director had been talking for about 15 minutes, thanking team leads, recognizing partner firms, calling names of scientists, engineers, support specialists. Then he paused. You could feel it, that shift in tone, a subtle change, like he was stepping slightly off script. There's one more contribution we need to acknowledge, he said, his voice steady. It didn't come from a PhD. It didn't arrive in a paper. And it wasn't part of the original plan. He looked down at a card in his hand, then up again. We had a critical failure in engine stabilization 12 months ago. The team was stuck. Simulations failed. Revisions failed. Deadlines were closing in. He glanced around the room. And then someone who wasn't even on payroll walked into a workshop and offered a solution that saved us. No publicity, no request for credit, just a pencil sketch, an old-school torque damper, and a quiet kind of genius. He paused again. Mr. Hank Delgado, would you please stand? For a second, nothing happened. Then a few heads turned. I felt their eyes before I moved. My seat was near the aisle. I stood slowly, quietly, not fully sure what to do. I didn't expect this. The air shifted. Someone near the front row whispered something to the person beside him. A ripple of awareness began spreading seat by seat, like people suddenly trying to remember if they'd ever seen me before, ever heard my name in a meeting, ever connected the dots. I looked toward the stage. And that's when Darren turned around. He had been mid-conversation with someone in the front row, notebook in hand, expression relaxed. Then he saw me. At first he didn't react. His eyes just registered a face he hadn't seen in years. Then confusion settled in. His brow furrowed. He looked again more carefully. It was a long look, and I could see it the moment he realized. His jaw tightened. His lips parted just slightly, but no words came out. He looked back toward the program director, then back at me. He didn't stand, not yet. He just stared. I gave a small nod. That was all. Then sat back down. No music played. No clapping followed. But something had shifted. The program director continued. Sometimes brilliance doesn't wear a title. Sometimes it doesn't sit in the spotlight. It works quietly behind bolts and blueprints, making the impossible a little less impossible. He tapped the card once. We couldn't have launched without Mir Delgado's input. And we almost didn't. Another pause. Then he moved on to the final part of the ceremony, never elaborating further. The audience never fully turned their attention back. Whispers moved like waves. I kept my head low. When the ceremony ended, most people filtered out toward the back, grabbing coffee, chatting politely. I stayed seated. Darren didn't approach me. Not right away. But I watched him. He was clearly rattled. You can tell a person's mind is racing when they move too still. He wasn't talking to anyone. Just flipping through his folder, then closing it. Then opening it again. He finally walked out of the main hall. I thought that might be it. But 10 minutes later, I felt a presence behind me. Hank. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. I turned. There he was. My son. His face was guarded. Not angry, not cold, just restrained. Like he didn't know what expression to wear. You didn't tell me you were involved in this, he said. I shrugged lightly. Didn't think it mattered. He stared. I've been working on this launch team for 2 years, he said. I know, and you were in the files. I nodded. Not by name. He paused. Then carefully, almost cautiously, he asked, was it your design? He didn't need to say what. I knew he meant the stabilizer, the torque damper. Yes, I said. He blinked. I thought Dr. Fields came up with that. He presented it as a group suggestion. I looked away. I told them not to put my name on it. Why? My voice came low, because I figured you wouldn't want your colleagues knowing your dad, the guy who fixes cars, saved your project. He didn't respond right away. Then he sat down beside me. It was the first time we had shared a bench in over 10 years. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at the floor. "How long have you been working with NASA?" he asked. I smiled just a little. "Longer than you've had your degree." He exhaled slowly. Silence settled between us, not tense, just real. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I used to think what you did didn't matter because it didn't have a title, because it wasn't in a journal or a lab." He looked at me. "But without that design, we wouldn't have cleared the safety deadline." I didn't answer. He wasn't finished. I read the torque distribution logs last month, thought they were too clean, too intuitive, not like the simulations. "Now it makes sense." He rubbed his jaw. "You've always seen the angles before I do." Still, I said nothing. I wanted him to say it fully, out loud, not implied. He didn't, not yet, but I could see it in his face. A reckoning was happening inside him. And then came the moment that hit harder than any spotlight. He reached into his folder and pulled out the project blueprint. Not the latest one, but the one from a year ago, the failed version. He unfolded it, turned to a section near the margin, and pointed to a note in pencil. There it was. My handwriting. Tiny. Barely legible. Just 3 words. Too rigid. Breathe. He stared at it. "You wrote this." I nodded. He stared longer. Then almost in a whisper he said, "You saved it. The whole mission." And that was the first time my son looked at me like I wasn't invisible. Darren didn't say anything else that day. After we sat together for a few more quiet minutes, he folded the blueprint, tucked it back into his folder, and stood. He didn't offer a hug, didn't apologize, didn't explain the years of silence. But he did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder and gave it a small squeeze. Then he walked away. And that was something. A week passed. I didn't expect to hear from him again. I figured the moment had passed that our brief connection would sink back into whatever space fathers and sons use to store unresolved things. But then, on a rainy Thursday morning, a plain envelope arrived in my mailbox. No name on the front. Inside was a short typed note and a flash drive. The note read, "You should see what they're really saying. Thought you deserved to know." I plugged in the flash drive. It contained a folder titled Artemis T7 Engineering Archive, Restricted. Inside were memos, internal communications design revisions, things I'd never been cleared to see. And then I found it a chain of emails between Darren and the propulsion team lead dated 2 days after the ceremony. In the first email, Darren had written, "We need to reassign technical credit for the TSD torque stabilizer design. The current log lists Fields as primary contributor. That's inaccurate." The reply came quickly. Fields submitted the model. "You suggesting it wasn't his?" Then Darren responded, "The original concept came from Hank Delgado, my father. He sketched it by hand. I verified this in person. He refused attribution at the time, but the record needs to reflect the truth." There was a pause in the chain for about a day. Then finally, another message. "We'll make the adjustment in the closed archive. External files are finalized, but internal logs will be updated." And they were. I checked the revision history. The engineering credit now read Torque Stabilizer Configuration V.7 Concept Source, Delgado H Contractor Advisor. That was it. No public announcement, no headlines. Just a line in a secure file buried in a folder most people would never open. But to me, it meant everything. I didn't reply to the note. Darren hadn't asked for anything in return. And I knew better than to poke at something that was still healing. Instead, I went back to work. I had 1 more month before retirement. The shop buzzed with talk of the upcoming launch. Final checks, pressure systems, simulated loads. Most of it wasn't my concern anymore. But there was one small issue with the booster clamp release system. A minor inconsistency in pressure timing. They called me in one last time. I spent 4 hours with the team, hands in gloves, grease under my nails, thinking quietly, listening for what the machine was trying to say. Then I gave them my answer. Not a redesign, just a 2.5 mm shift in the hydraulic line valve to even the discharge. It worked. I was done. My last official day at the shop came and went without fanfare. I cleaned my locker, left my badge on the desk, and walked out under a pale sky with my thermos in hand and 60 years of silence behind me. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, the launch happened. Artemis T7 rose through the clouds like it belonged there, a streak of white fire and thunder, its stabilizers holding true, its frame steady, and my phone buzzed. It was Darren. A text. Just 4 words. It flew. Because you. That was the first time he'd ever thanked me. I stared at the message for a long time before I responded. I typed, "Proud of you too," and left it at that. But the twist, the one that caught me by surprise, came a few months later. It was a gray October morning. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when I got an email from a contact in the records department. Subject line FYI, Media Prep Draft. I opened the attachment. It was a draft for a NASA internal documentary series titled Hands Behind the Hardware. Each episode featured a different team or contributor who had played a pivotal but under-recognized role in mission success, and listed for Episode 3, The Man Who Built Stabilizers Out of Dust, featuring Hank Delgado. I blinked. Below was a short summary. Hank Delgado, former contractor technician, contributed a design adjustment that prevented torque destabilization during the Artemis T7 build. A self-taught mechanic with no formal engineering degree, Delgado's solution was credited internally with saving the launch. At the bottom in fine print was a line that made me put the coffee down. Interview scheduled and arranged by Darren Delgado. I never agreed to be on camera. Didn't even know they were planning to include me. But a few days later, a young woman with a small camera and a calm voice knocked on my door. She asked if I'd be willing to tell my story. I told her I didn't have much of one. She said Darren disagreed. We filmed for an hour. I showed her my old notes, my worn-out blueprints, the torque ring I still kept on my shelf. I told her about growing up in a machine shop, about learning to fix what others gave up on. At the end, she asked, "What do you want your legacy to be?" I paused. Then I said that sometimes the quiet ones are right. She smiled and nodded. The episode aired internally a month later. Not on public networks, but to NASA staff partners and the internal leadership cohort. I didn't watch it live, but Darren did. He sent me a photo of his office screen with my face on it and a caption, "Everyone finally knows." Took long enough. But the twist hadn't finished unfolding yet. 2 weeks after the episode aired, I got another envelope. This time thick. Official. Inside was a letter on letterhead from the National Aerospace Historical Registry. It read, "We are pleased to notify you that your contribution to the Artemis T7 mission has been nominated for permanent archival recognition. Pending approval, your name and design notes will be entered into the Federal Repository of Pivotal Engineering Contributions." Below it was a scanned copy of the submission document. Prepared and signed by Darren Delgado. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I realized something. My son had done more than just recognize me. He had rewritten the story he used to tell himself and others about who I was, about what I was. And in doing that, he'd rewritten a part of himself too. One day I know he'll tell someone else the truth. Maybe his own kid, maybe a student, maybe just a colleague after a long shift. He'll say, "My father wasn't an engineer, but he knew machines better than anyone I've met. He taught me that silence isn't ignorance. Sometimes it's expertise waiting for someone to listen. And that will be enough." It's been 9 months since the Artemis T7 launch. I don't wear a uniform anymore. Don't carry a badge. Most mornings I wake up with no alarms, fix my coffee, and tinker with old engines in the shed behind my house. The torque ring sits on a shelf above my bench. Not framed, Not polished, just resting there used like it always was. I never did end up watching the documentary they made. I had the file saved, sure, but I couldn't bring myself to hit play. Not because I was embarrassed, but because the silence afterward was already enough. Recognition, when it finally comes, doesn't feel like applause. It feels like gravity, letting go of something you didn't realize you'd been carrying for decades. I got one more letter. This one didn't come from NASA or any agency. It was handwritten, simple, on lined paper folded in thirds, no envelope. I found it taped to the door of the shed one morning. It was from Darren. Dad, I used to think strength looked like control, precision, perfect systems. I never thought it could look like a man hunched over an engine at midnight covered in grease, whispering to bolts like they could hear him. But now I know. You were teaching me the whole time. I just wasn't listening. I'm sorry for the years I made you feel small. You never were. I just didn't understand your kind of quiet. But I do now. And I'm proud to be your son. D. I read it once, then again, then folded it and slid it into my wallet. It's still there, not for safekeeping, but because some truths deserve to be carried with you. A month later, I got a call from a local high school. Their engineering teacher had retired unexpectedly and someone had mentioned my name. They didn't want a full-time teacher, just someone to come by once a week, talk to the kids, show them the guts of an engine. Maybe talk about problem solving when the math doesn't tell the whole story. At first I said no, but then I thought about it. All those years I spent fixing things alone. Solving problems no one saw. Building solutions no one understood until the crisis was already averted. Maybe it was time to pass that on. So now every Thursday afternoon I stand in a workshop that smells like youth and sawdust and half-finished projects. I don't lecture. I don't bring slides. I just roll up my sleeves and ask, what's broken? They show me engines that won't start, circuits that won't close, 3D prints that warped in the heat. I ask them questions, push them to notice the friction, the tension, the imbalance. And sometimes I tell them about a time when a ship was about to fail and the person who fixed it didn't have a degree, just a wrench, a pencil, and a habit of listening harder than most people speak. I don't tell them it was me, not at first, because I want them to know the value of invisible work before they attach it to a name. Sometimes Darren visits. He doesn't wear the suit anymore, just jeans and a jacket. He walks in like he's one of them, smiles at the students, shakes hands with the staff. Last month he brought a model of the Artemis T7 booster to the class. Said he wanted the students to understand how tiny miscalculations can lead to big failures and how tiny adjustments can save a mission. One of the students asked, "Who fixed it?" Darren paused. Then he pointed at me. "This guy," he said. But he did it before I believed he could. The students turned to me. I smiled, a little embarrassed. Then one kid said, "Mr. Delgado, why didn't you take credit sooner?" And I told them the truth. Sometimes I said you don't need to be seen. You just need the thing you built to work. Later that night, Darren and I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee like old friends. We didn't talk about the past. Not directly. But there were moments, pauses between words where I could feel the repairs happening in real time. Not on machines, on us. Before he left, he handed me a small box. I opened it. Inside was a lapel pin, brass, engraved. It read Artemis T7, Torque Stabilizer Configuration V.7 Delgado H. I stared at it for a long time, not because I wanted to wear it, but because for once, someone had etched my name into something built to last. "You earned it," Darren said. I looked up. "So did you." He nodded. We didn't say more. He left. And the house for once didn't feel too quiet. It just felt full. That night I pinned the badge next to the note he left me. taped it inside the shed above the workbench, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That silence is powerful, but acknowledgement, that quiet kind of truth, is even stronger. And sometimes you don't get it when you want it. You get it when you're ready. I used to think legacy was what you left behind, but now I think it's what stays standing when you stop needing to prove anything. So that's where I live now. Not in a mission file, not in a database, not even in the documentary, but in a Thursday workshop with students who still think torque is magic and failure is permanent, and in the quiet, knowing glances of a son who finally saw what was there the whole time. I'm Hank Delgado. I used to build machines no one could see. Now I help build people who might one day do the same. And if I've done it right, maybe one day one of them will be standing in some far-off place, wrench in hand, engine in pieces, doubt in the room. And they'll remember that precision doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears boots, scars, and a quiet kind of love. And they'll say, "Let's fix this." Mr. Delgado would have known how.